Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. Sorry. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Andrew Propek, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu, or you could speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel, and you can also access videos of past programs through this YouTube channel as well. A loop hearing system is available if you have a T-coil hearing aid, and we also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system or at any time during the program have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. And if you're a part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. So please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming our director, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. What a wonderful crowd we have here from folks that are here in the community and then also from far and wide. So we are so glad you're here this evening. It's an extraordinary opportunity to spotlight some of our nation's most dedicated public servants, our elections administrators, and many of them who are based locally are here in the audience tonight. The Edward Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate has been an institutional friend of ours for many years, so I was thrilled when their CEO, Adam Hines, reached out to me to explore substantive opportunities for us here at the Dole Institute to partner and continue our namesake's legacy together. Here at the Institute, over the last couple of years, we've hosted discussions with Douglas County Clerk and Elections Officer Jamie Shew and other Kansas County clerks, as well as Secretaries of State Brad Raffensperger and Mary Toulouse Oliver. So when Adam broached the subject of an extended project on elections administration, particularly funding, having identified nationally recognized elections administrator and expert Tammy Patrick, this was just a wonderful and timely opportunity for us here at the Dole Institute, combining our institution's shared commitment to the processes, the qualities of leadership that support a vibrant democracy. It was a natural fit. So pleased to have you all with us today. Before I turn it over to Adam, I want to express thanks to many folks in the audience on behalf of the Dole Institute, to Adam himself, to Emily Rapp, to Tammy Patrick, and our own Jackson DeAndrea, our Senior Associate Director, Barbara Ballard, and Beth Visosky, who worked to make this event a wonderful success both this evening and into the weekend to come. We also want to recognize in addition to our program guests, Jamie Shew and Secretary Scott Schwab. As I mentioned, we have several elections officials in the audience this evening, including U.S. Elections Assistance Commissioners Donald Palmer and Benjamin Hovland. Will you join me in recognizing and thanking these gentlemen for their service? And also any other elections officials in the audience, will you stand or wave or so we can express some appreciation for what you do? Thank you so much. Former Congressman Steve Dryhouse is also with us this evening, representing the Former Members of Congress Association. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. And also our good friend Fred Logan, who's a member of our Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Fred, that sounds like a promotion. Thank you, Fred, for being with us. Our conversation tonight kicks off an extended conversation with these elections administrators and elections experts, many of which have come in from all parts of the country, but also here at KU with Zach Moore. Would you guys stand and wave so we can thank you for your service and your contributions? Our purpose tonight and with this collaboration is very fundamental. In a democracy, policy recommendations go nowhere without political will. Political will starts at the grassroots level, and public awareness and education about bolstering our elections, that's where we're starting with tonight with all of you. So thank you so much for being here with us at the Dole Institute. Please join me in welcoming our friend and colleague, CEO of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate, Adam Hines.
All right, thank you, Audrey. I really appreciate those remarks, and I'm so glad you gave our teams a shout out. They've been just tremendous in putting this evening together and this whole project. And I have to say how much of an honor it is for me to be standing here in the Dole Institute as we launch this partnership focused on bolstering our nation's election system. And maybe most importantly, I can't say enough about how much trust has infused our relationship right from the start in this work. And so I want to thank you so much, Audrey, for that. Thank you, Secretary Schwab and Clerk Shew. We're looking forward to your remarks and your wisdom. And so I'll get out of your way quickly here in a moment. But first, as Audrey noted, what's driving this partnership is the fact that elections certainly are a central pillar of our democracy. And while elections are reliable and secure, it's also true that our election system is also underfunded. And so the concern, of course, is the fact that when you have chronic underfunding, that it increases the risk that problems can occur, or they might occur. At the same time, as we've learned through this process and with the tutelage of our elections expert, the mere effort to develop solutions to that challenge, you immediately run into incredibly complex challenges around funding when you're talking about the complex web of differences that exist across the 8,000 elections jurisdictions in this country. The good news is there is much that is known, and in many instances it's due to the folks who are in this room, who have been doing this work and who are participating tonight and in the symposium tomorrow. And so that's another reason why this partnership aims to bring together those national experts and leading researchers in the field to explore and try to clarify the ways that elections are funded in this country. And so the first step is of this project is to be clear about those various funding models that currently exist at the local, state, and federal level. And we hope to empower the elections workers and administrators themselves at the local, state, and federal level to identify the funding solution that works for each of you and that makes sense in each jurisdiction, as long as it results in reliable and sufficient funding. I'm sure there's a word that I'm supposed to be using there that I'll know at the end of this. I just wanted to kind of say another quick word about this relationship, and I find it incredibly meaningful that this effort is being led by a partnership that includes the institutes of a great Republican and a great Democrat. 2 senators and now 2 institutes dedicated to dialogue and deliberation. And Senators Dole and Kennedy were so committed to that principle that they participated together in a radio show in the 80s for 2 years called Face Off, the radio show. And then, they, of course, throughout their career, collaborated regularly across the aisle when it mattered most to Americans. That was, for example, when they were passing an extension of the Voting Rights Act or when passing the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there are lots of examples, some of which we kind of see in the halls around us, which is just impressive. So I do want to say that what strikes me when you're looking at that relationship is that the fact that bolstering our elections infrastructure remains one of those vital issues that they were working on and requires working across the aisle. And this is one of those times in our history when doing so and working together in support of this pillar of our democracy is more important than ever before. So thanks again for your interest tonight. And now I have the privilege of introducing our content lead on the project, Tammy Patrick, who you've heard and will soon know is co-CEO of the Election Center of the National Association of Election Officials. And she's been working on election administration for 20 years, maybe more than 20 years now. Served as a commissioner on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration and was a federal compliance officer for Maricopa County elections in Arizona for 11 years. So if you are looking for a nationally recognized elections expert, Tammy is who you are looking for. Thank you so much, Tammy, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam and Audrey both. I'm both incredibly honored and humbled to be here tonight. I mean, it's just amazing, and that stained glass over behind all of you is very intimidating because it means a lot to me, as I know it means a lot to you all and to every American. I often say that every election has a story to tell, and sometimes we don't know what that story is going to be until long after the election. Sometimes that story is joyous. I will say that I was in Kansas in 2015, and I came to Kansas City to do some data collection because they were going to be rolling out some new poll books. Now, it just so happened, any of you baseball fans in the audience, that was the year that the Royals won the World Series. And there was we didn't know that when we booked it, honestly, and we didn't know what would happen. Would the poll workers show up? And so we got out to the polls. We were heading away from downtown, so we saw all the cars parked in the ditches where people just got out of the traffic jams and started walking to the parade. And we started, yeah, there were a few of you. Anybody else in the audience? Exactly. And we thought, this is going to be the boringest election day ever. There aren't going to be any voters. There aren't going to be any poll workers. But we showed up at the polling place, and time and again, poll workers said, I've waited my whole life for this. But today's election day, and I have a duty. And so I'm here. And almost every one of them showed up. And some voters did too in that particular election. It was a local election, so, but here's the thing, is that parade ended, like all the parades in Kansas, at Union Station. How many of you knew that that's the Board of Elections' main headquarters is in Union Station? So that day, they thought, oh my goodness, what are we going to feed people? Because that's the big thing in elections. Any of you poll workers? It's all about the food, right? Who's bringing the potluck? Who's bringing the things? And they thought, how are we going to possibly feed people because we can't get in, we can't get out? And so even a joyous thing like that World Series win had complications in elections. Now, we know that sometimes parades aren't joyous, sometimes tragic. And our hearts really go out to everyone who was impacted yesterday, because in elections, you can have things happen that are good, and you can have things happen that are bad. And even though yesterday wasn't an election day, it happened right outside that elections office. And as we think about those who serve our communities, those people who were there to protect the crowd, those people who are there to protect your vote, we want to make sure they're sufficiently funded, no matter what that public servant's role is. And that's really what this effort is all about, is let's talk about how are our elections funded? What are the models across the country? And so it's really important that we make sure that all of our election officials who are serving the American voter in that sacred act, that they have the resources that they need to serve them effectively. So this event, as I mentioned, kicks off that initiative, and I'm, again, so humbled and excited to be part of it. And I'm really excited for this evening's fireside chat, as it were. And so first, I want to introduce your Secretary of State, Scott Schwab, who is the 32nd Secretary of State. He served in the House of Representatives for the 49th District, if I did my homework properly, from 2009 to 2019, and he was elected Secretary of State in 2018. He asked me to keep this very brief, by the way, and you have his bios. We're also going to have the discussion led by Douglas County Clerk Jamie Shew, who was elected in 2004, so he's been in office for 20 years. I think I've known you all 20 of those years, but we're not that old. Jamie...
He's 24.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, there you go. Attained his certification through Auburn University and the Election Center, which we refer to as CERA, in 2017, and it's the highest certification achievement you could receive in the United States. He's active in associations both here at the state level as well as nationally. So I'm thrilled to turn it over to the two of them to share their perspectives on how funding happens in elections in Kansas. Gentlemen?
All right. First of all, thank you for coming here. For us, funding elections sounds very exciting. We didn't know if anybody else would find it exciting, right?
There's some boring topics. I'm like, well, I thought that was one, but it's a conversation.
Right, yeah.
So.
I would like to thank the Dole Institute for inviting us.
Absolutely.
One of the really cool things bringing in people from across the country is we get to showcase the Dole Institute, which those of us from here know is an amazing facility that does great work, and we get to showcase that. So first of all, welcome to the Dole Institute. Welcome to Douglas County. I might be a little biased, but one of the best counties in Kansas. No offense to my peers. And Tammy made me think about something. We are at the home of the Kansas Jayhawks. Used to be until 2017, we held our city school elections in the general was in April, the first Tuesday in April, which would always be the day after the national championship for the NCAA. I am probably one of the few election offices that had a coup plan, which was how do I deal with, if we win the national championship, the fact that our office was downtown. And if you've ever been in Lawrence when we win a national championship, you're not going to get near downtown.
Well, you're not getting down there on a Friday, generally.
Right, exactly.
So.
And then, so it was kind of sad when we moved it to the fall, because I no longer have the national championship coup plan. But I'm very excited. Also, for those of you that are new.
You looked at me like that because I was in the legislature and I voted for it. So
no, I think it's a great idea. Those of you that are also new here, you need to know the words rock, chalk, Jayhawk. All right, very important words to know. Share that with people, huh?
yes, very important.
Okay, so we're going to have a conversation, and I'm really excited about this. I have a lot of respect for Secretary Schwab. We have worked together for not just while Secretary Schwab has been Secretary of State, but he used to be the chair of the House Elections Committee. So we worked together on a lot of stuff there. So
We stopped some bad ideas.
yeah, but some really good ones also happened. So that's going to be the first thing I'm going to start out with. You know, you were House Chair of Elections. You've been Secretary of State. What was the thing that probably surprised you most about elections and funding elections?
So it's a good question because, and by the way, hi Fred, I saw you earlier. I've never seen you not in a suit.
I did it for you.
You still look sharp. I was on elections, as elections chair, we don't deal with funding. We deal with process. The appropriations deals with funding. So I was on appropriations for one stint, one tour of duty, and got off because I hated appropriations committee. And I'm a comms guy. I was a journalism major. I'm a policy wonk. I'm not mathematician. Now, before we get into elections, the Secretary of State doesn't count votes, so don't let that fog your concerns. But I didn't know the state does not fund elections. The counties fund their elections. We fund our elections division through fees coming through other areas in our agency, which is mostly business division. Business filings and the surpluses there pay for the salaries there. And then we have technology fund that funds technology for the entire office. But it's locals. And it's unique because Kansas has 105 counties because our counties network were established according to cattle trade. Because if you go back to the 1860s, what happened is the way you traded cattle was normally at county fairs or county events. And you can look at a map and count the county seats, and each county seat was about 20 miles apart, which is one day's travel. They can count the number of days it took to get to that market before, Abilene became the first cow town and completely just changed up the way we traded cattle. And so now we have 105 election clerks. We have Johnson County, which is our most populous county, which in a post-audit from the legislature is also our most secure election office. And then we have places like Douglas County where we have immense institutional knowledge with Jamie, and they still have significant resources. But then you get out to Kearney County, you have a county clerk with a part-time assistant. And that county clerk not only does elections, she also handles, well, you do too, the county financial affairs and things. So it's really diverse. And it's like, well, what Kearney County needs isn't what Johnson County needs. And then you have Wyandotte County with a more below the poverty line population, but still a large county, still has resources that they need to fund their office, and Mike's doing a good job. And then you have situations in Sedgwick County where they have resources, but political dynamics, they didn't like their clerk at a certain time and just started cutting funding just for political purposes. So the benefit is those local units of government can fund according to the level of which they need. You don't need to fund Kearney County to the level you fund Douglas County. But then you do fall into political dynamics, though, is those county board of commissioners can say, you know what, I'm mad at my clerk, we're cutting their office. And that affects, it's sort of one of those things. It's like, well, when you hurt your son, you're also hurting the generation that comes up from your son. So you got to be careful the way you handle children. Our clerks are adults, but if you hurt their offices, you're hurting the people they're trying to serve, which is the voter. And so those dynamics are challenging. And I'm sure, you've got a good county commission for you here, correct?
Correct, yeah. Yeah, first of all,
we can go to Missouri and ask that question.
Do I have any commissioners here? They're the best, they're the greatest. It is true when you look at, so one of the things that happened a few years ago was the legislature asked legislative post-audit to do an audit of, originally I think they asked for every county.
It was impossible.
And the post-audit office was like, there's no way to do that. It was kind of fun when, so legislative post-audit, they are auditors. They audit all kinds of things across the state. They were shocked at how complex elections were. I remember when they came to our office and they're like, this is just not what we thought this was going to be. And you could see, in my opinion, when the results came out, a huge discrepancy between the larger counties and the smaller counties.
Yep.
And to me, that's funding and resources.
Correct.
And I've been really lucky. I've had a number of county commissions. Each one of them, no matter the makeup, they've been really supportive of our office, about a lot of the initiatives that we do. When I took office, I'm pretty frugal, and
by the way, we did a massive grant, and Jamie didn't take any money so that our more poorer counties would have more resources. So when he says that, for a Democrat, he's pretty dang frugal.
And when you run for office, you think that you've got it all figured out, because I was not in the office. And I remember looking at the budget thinking, oh, this budget is too huge. I'm just going to cut all kinds of stuff, and it's going to look great my first term. I realized we were way underfunded. And I think the thing that shocked me the most when I started was just how much it costs to run an election, just the basics to run even the smallest election.
Yeah, and so this year in Kansas, we're doing something we haven't done since 92, 93. We're having a presidential preference primary, which I personally, take the Secretary of State hat off and set it down here on the floor. Personally, I think it's a waste of money. That's more of a political activity. I really believe the party should determine, because when you do those presidential preference primaries, the parties still determine what allocation of delegates that affects. And so they can have their own, they always did caucuses, and that had a bit, and then they have super delegates. And so it's a political process. And the reason why it's called a presidential preference primary is because normally when we have a primary, you win your primary, your name's on the ballot in November. A presidential, if Ron DeSantis wins this thing in March, his name's not going to be on the ballot in November. So but we haven't done a spring election since, was it 2017?
2017.
So now we're doing 3 elections in 1 year. And outside of bond elections, we've never done 3 elections in 1 year.
I just had a school board call one for May, so I have 4.
Okay, so which goes to the issue. So we push legislature saying, if you're going to put this resource on the counties, then you're going to pay for it to the tune of $5 million. That may not seem like much, but we're not buying new equipment. We're just paying poll workers. Most of it's poll workers is what we're paying for in printing. But you're going to reimburse those counties because you're putting a burden on them, which goes against what I normally say is I like those elections being funded locally, but we don't mandate extra duty just because they didn't want their can I say it? I'm going to say it. I had a contentious primary and I had a somewhat less contentious, but contentious general, and both those opponents criticized clerks and myself about how we run an election. Each of those became chairs of the respective parties. My primary opponent became chair of the Republican Party, the Democrat became chair of the Democrat Party. The first thing they did was ask us to do an election because they didn't want to do it. I just feel it's so redeeming for our clerks because they were the ones under the wire. But yeah, that's one of those things. It's just like, it's the curveball on funding. The pandemic created nuances. I mean, what did your office run into because of the pandemic?
Well, we had to, I remember as the pandemic was happening, being on the phone, not just with my peers across the state, but across the country, redefining how we do elections. If you think about elections, very tactile. It is very person-based. Suddenly, by the way, COOP plans are continuity of operations plans. And you have all these tabletop exercises, and they're beautiful. When you get into an actual pandemic, you realize 80% of what you thought was going to work wasn't going to work. You just kind of go, well, that was cute that we tried that.
You said it like that.
So, right. And so, you know, we reinvented everything and got really creative. One of the things we did, so we operated out of the courthouse down on Mass Street. We realized we could not social distance out of there. So I rented an old Sears store out on Iowa. And one of the first things we did was we split our staff. The deputy clerk of elections operated with half the staff out of there. I operated with half the staff out of the courthouse, so that if one of us went down, at least we haven't exposed the other person. I don't recommend that because it was really hard. We worked so closely together, and we were basically operating from afar. Trying to figure out how to fund that, I think the federal funding that came in was huge. We would not have been able to do it without some of that extra funding that happened. Yeah. But you still had to do it. The thing I talk about with elections, you don't get on election day the ability to say, you know what, we're not ready, so come back tomorrow. You know, we'll be ready tomorrow. So November was still going to happen, right?
It's what we call a hard deadline.
Yes, and we had all kinds of plans. We were going to do mobile voting through the fairgrounds, and so we didn't do those, but we put a lot of those in place. We were lucky. Our primary is later, so our primary is in August, so a lot of states went before us and allowed us. Yeah, we learned a lot from them, what not to do, and we borrowed a lot of ideas. One of the things that you hear about in elections is we borrow a lot of ideas from each other.
Yes.
So kind of going to that, one of the things that I don't know was mentioned, Scott is the president of the National Association of Secretary of States, proudly representing Kansas. Each state, I refer to elections as one of the greatest examples of federalism we have.
Yes.
If you want to teach federalism, look at elections, because there is no national, the Election Assistance Commission is there to provide assistance, but there's no national election system. You talk to people from other countries, they're shocked that there's not like a overarching body that tells us what to do. And even at the state level, it's cooperation with the Secretary of State, but it is a local control kind of thing. Each state funds differently.
Correct.
So could you talk a little bit about what you see at the national level, and are there models that you think work or don't work?
Well, I'm always going to say the Kansas model works. And every state says they do it the best, which is, again, going back to federalism. And I won't say it's contentious, but it's a debate we have amongst our associations. We had Caleb Hayes, a great Kansan, KU law grad, he is the attorney for the Committee of Congressional Affairs in the U.S. House. And we brought him in to say, you know, what election things are going on, and just basically the federal government's not going to spend funding. To which certain states, we call them top-down states, like Georgia, Minnesota, New Mexico, the Secretary of State's office funds all elections. We're a bottom-up state. I don't fund any elections unless it's through a grant from the EAC. It's bottom-up. The locals pay for it. And so it becomes a conflict of a couple of, really, they're big hurdles. One, for me, if I take federal funding, I have to have a match. Normally, when that funding comes, my legislature's not in session. Now, I'm a fool if I don't take it, because we're a net loser on taxes typically in Kansas and on the federal level. So now it's a way for us to get those tax dollars back for something that is an absolute duty of government. This is not something you can privatize. And so, but if I take that money, I have to agree to a match and then go to the legislature the following January and say, I need you to forgive me, but I just spent some of your money, and I need you to give me money because we've gotten this. And I have good relationships with those, we get them, but it really does put you in an uncomfortable predicament that you're spending money without authority from the legislature, which is technically unconstitutional. So there's a struggle there. The other struggle is you have states that are top down that they want consistent funding from the feds. Well, if you're going to get consistent funding from the feds, you're not going to like the strings that come across. And those strings will change according to who's in power. So HR 1 and S1 and the Congress was a bipartisan concern in our association because some of the strings attached, the funding was not sufficient. Some of the mandates on early in-person voting on my smaller counties, it just was going to, we couldn't meet the threshold. We were going to break law, and there was no way for us to meet the law. And so if you have the consistent funding, then you're undoing the federalism. And each state had, I mean, I don't criticize Washington because they're all mail ballot. They were 73% mail ballot when they went to 100% mail ballot, and part of it's because of terrain. And so, okay, you're a state. You have the right to go do it. It's what's right for you. In Kansas, we're 30% advanced mail ballot. If I got a mandate from the feds that says we're shutting down in-person voting, could you imagine how that would change the political atmosphere in a state like Kansas? So that becomes a challenge. So then we do the once and every now and then grant through the EAC, which was HAVA, which, by the way, was mostly written by former Secretary of State Ron Thornburg, because he was the last Kansas Secretary of State to be president of the National Association. Bush v. Gore happened, and they were updating equipment, changing the way folks vote because of one county in the country, which was really dramatic. But there were a lot of improvements that come. So then we get these grants from the EAC, and it's one-time money, which is sometimes incredibly helpful because we don't have pandemics every year. But when I have a pandemic, I can't have a county raise taxes fast enough and get the funds in to be agile enough to do that. Here, to be even more complicated still, when we get that money, we don't just spend it, we sit on it because we don't know what we're going to need it for. We did the audit and the grant thing. We talked more about that. We ended up finding out a lot of our counties weren't securing the equipment adequately, and they didn't have the funds, and we were able to use our HAVA money to help them out. So Congress says, well, why would we give them more money? They're sitting on money. Or sitting on money because we don't know if you're ever going to give us any more money, and I may not want you to because then I got to spend my legislative dollars in a way that makes my speaker mad at me. Funding elections is an incredibly difficult political dynamic. And then it goes down to the local area where you've got a decision with 105 colleagues. If I take this, my friend out in, Ellis County gets less.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it dawned on me. So former Secretary of State Thornburg was NAS president. Bush v. Gore, you're NAS president in 2024. I don't know if there's good luck there.
I would say you wouldn't have wanted somebody else.
Right, exactly. The Help America Vote Act is an interesting thing to look at. I was
real quick, just proof that we're not drinking vodka.
That could be a more interesting conversation. I was elected in 2004, and so one of the first things I had to do as county clerk was implement the Help America Vote Act and new equipment. And one of the things I like to talk about when people talk about a top-down state, so Georgia was a good example. We had some people from Georgia come out and talk to all the county clerks, and they basically made the decision for their entire state. It was all one system. I had town hall meetings talking about what should we do, and it was clear for my community, we needed to be a paper-based system, especially if I wanted to get reelected in 2008. For other counties in Kansas, they moved to other options. So the thing I like about a bottom-up was I chose what was good for my county. It's not necessarily what was good for a neighboring county, right? The Help America Vote Act was really good to help really modernize our entire election system. And one of the things I like to talk about with HAVA, it required an ADA machine in every polling place. And you'll hear some people will say, well, that's a complete waste because that ADA machine sits in my polling place. No one ever uses it. Why would you fund it? I can tell you the coolest part when we put in the ADA machine were voters of mine who their entire life, they're 60 years old, got to vote independently for the first time without two board workers reading their ballot and marking their ballot for them. So it was worth that investment. One of the challenges, in my opinion, with one-time dollars like HAVA, I did a bunch of research on it to show what HAVA did was we all bought at the same time. First of all, that was a supply challenge for all the vendors. There was not enough for every state to suddenly get new equipment. Also, they all have the same life cycle. So that means we all aged out our equipment at the exact same time, and HAVA was spent. So it did create some challenges 10 years later as we kind of looked as our machines were starting to age out. So I think that while constant funding maybe has, there's lots of debate about it.
Right.
I think some funding that does have some regularity.
Even if it's not every year or every election cycle.
Yes. Or that we have access to, right? Because some equipment has longer lifespans, right?
Yeah.
And also, as we also talk about, our computers, they change very quickly. 10 years is a long time.
Yes.
For a piece of equipment. And we do a lot of maintenance and stuff. But so I think that while constant funding isn't necessarily the answer, I think there is some regularity to funding that can be.
And the issue, and I don't know all the nuances that it relates with the EAC as it relates to when and we do and do not get money. And it's a representative board that they vote. And from my perspective, is we don't use the money for equipment. We use the money to give to the county, and if the county uses it for equipment, that's their choice. If they hung on the dollars or had surpluses. And sometimes it's not even equipment related at all because, well, we just bought equipment last year and you didn't give us any money. Now I can't give money to a county that may need it because it becomes a civil war of, well, they got it, I didn't get it. We normally say we're paying for this, or the latest round was security because we found out a lot of counties, they were storing counties were storing their election equipment in the hallway. Okay, your gas, to them, they trust their neighbors, they're not going to touch it. No, it's the crazy person from Colorado across the border who's going to take it, break it open, take pictures, put it on the internet, and then China now sees it, which they would love. We've said, okay, you have to secure this stuff. Oh, but we don't have any money. Okay, so we're going to release our HAVA funds for that. And now we have new standards coming out on election equipment over the next several years, which is significant, which means, again, the staggering is going to become an issue. So I don't know how the EAC does it. Granted, they don't get money unless the Congress gives it to them and the president signs it. But there definitely needs to be some foresight going forward, especially with new standards and what the equipment's going to be and what that impact's going to be on counties. Because we're finding out that with the touch screens, which adds to the national discourse, I'm touching it and it's voting the other guy. Well, the machines just needs to be recalibrated. Because if you're constantly touching it, the calibration goes off. And so they just recalibrate it. It's not a very big issue. It's easy to do. The older that equipment gets, the more it needs to be recalibrated. the more it needs to be recalibrated, the more people don't trust the equipment. The more people don't trust the equipment, you see where the road ends. So that's the foresight we have on the national conversation is, you know, how, I feel bad for Minnesota. Like right now, I don't need any more federal funds in Kansas. I mean, when during the pandemic, I had counties sending money back. They didn't need it because they're so well managed. Minnesota's in a hole because he can't get a tax increase out of his state. So he's like asking the feds to bail him out. And I'm like telling my senator, I don't need any more money because the political dynamic that comes with it, creates more problems than it's going to solve today. Maybe not 4 years, but just in the current environment, it's going to create problems for me. So he's like, well, don't tell your senator. I'm like, hey, you can tell my senator to give you money, but that's not the way the Congress works. Either all 50 states and jurisdictions get it or they don't. And so on a national level, it's difficult. Hopefully, I mean, I'm going to let you be 100% honest, totally critical with me, because I can't fire you. How are we doing as it relates to the grants and stuff, and trying to weigh needs and assessment and versus we don't know if we're going to get another grant or not? So
It's the best ever. No.
You're my
You know,
friend.
I think one of the things that I do appreciate, the Secretary of State's office has been extremely cautious. And I hear a lot of clerks that will say, why don't they just release the money? And I know some investments were made in some security stuff that maybe the clerks didn't see.
Yeah.
But I think that's a balance there because, like you said, there were states that took the HAVA money and then went really fast and then they were out. So, and I'm not saying that, you know, because we're up here, but I do feel that it has been, I think your current administration has done a really good job at also getting it to the counties. There for a while, it was kind of stopping at the state, which is what we hear across the whole United
It's across the
States, is
country.
that sometimes it stops at the Secretary of State's office and doesn't get to the locals. I don't know if you saw, they just released $1.9 million in security grants to 85 counties, is
I
that
think
right?
it's about right. It's about
Yeah,
85.
that's
84.
right. And what Secretary Schwab won't tell you is that the initial amount was not that,
It was significantly less.
and you found it. Like you figured out a way
Well,
to
we
make it.
had it. It
Right.
just, it goes to the level of, raise your hand. Do you want the election equipment secured, right? We all want that secured. Okay. So then I didn't want to spend as much money as we did, but I'm like, I mean, this is a function of government. This isn't, you can make an argument on the municipal aquatic center competing with the local gym. That's an argument you say, is this a function of government? You can't argue that elections are an absolute function of government.
Well, I remember when you announced the initial amount, many of us were like, yeah, that's not going to touch it.
You can also thank my staff for saying, yeah, you're going to fix that.
And that kind of goes to something I want to touch on. You know, like when I got elected in 2004, post Bush v. Gore, HAVA was happening. I thought that was kind of a contentious era. I had no clue what a contentious era would
Can we
look
go
like.
back to hanging chads, please?
Right.
Can we just go back to
I
those
thought-
days?
I thought-
Such simpler times.
There was nowhere during that time did I end up in a fetal position, yet in the past 4 years, often I am in a fetal position. So talk about, I think we are in a very interesting time with elections.
Correct.
The past 4 years has been
A
a
challenge.
struggle because one of the things that I talk about a lot is we pulled off, I believe, in 2020, something that was amazing because not only did we pull off the election, for most of us, it was the largest election we ever ran. In Douglas County, we had not passed 60,000 voters. And my
In
staff,
that year.
my staff kept saying, we're going to pass 60. And I'm like, there's no way, right? I mean, I think 54 was the top. And we blew past 60. And we pulled it off. And the result was to be vilified and beat up and still 4 years later called into question. And it has impacted funding.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about just at the state level, and I can talk at the local level, what that has done for funding at elections, what we're going through right now.
Yeah, so it was a Georgia problem. It was a Michigan problem. It was a Pennsylvania problem, Arizona problem, and a little bit of Wisconsin. And it just started creeping into the states. And there was I caught my eye on a Wall Street Journal article, I can't remember when it was, but it said the industry of election fraud. It used to be the attorneys made money off election fraud claims and they made money off election suppression claims. I mean, Stacey Abrams paid attorneys to sue Georgia and lost all 4 or 5 cases. And, you know, we're seeing what's happening with Dominion and Fox News. Clearly not a win for Fox News. But it used to be the attorneys that made the money because that's what they do. If there's not a lawsuit, attorneys don't really do well. Now it's not, it's the YouTubers. They get clicks. And I've said this several times. I know people that give Dr. Franks, who's been disproven multiple times, and he's a math professor. I'm like, it's binary. You should be pretty easy. Either the answer's right or the answer's wrong. And we've shown you the answer's wrong, but people give him $200 a month. It's like it's a ministry of misinformation. And so those challenges come in, and you're like, then you read what happens in Colorado, where a clerk took her own election equipment and gave it to people to meddle with it. And that's what disrupts the trust in the elections. And so we have counties that border that area. Okay, you cannot put your voting machine in the hallway there. You can't. You can't put it in the supply closet. And so we had to create ways to protect it in a new environment. I mean, I remember a day that when I was a kid, we didn't fly much. I'm from Great Bend. You know, we kind of had an airport, but we would go to Wichita to pick up family who flew in. And you go through security, you go to the gate, and you greet your family. My brother, when I was in college, was coming home from the Navy on leave, and he didn't want to call my parents. He said, I want to surprise them. So can you pick me up at the airport? And I had a good friend who actually let me borrow his car. Probably a really bad idea, but he lent me his car. And I went down to the airport, and I went to go through the gate, and they're like, where's your boarding pass? I'm like, no, I'm picking up my brother. Then you wait there. Suddenly, we weren't allowed to go to the gate anymore. My brother's like, where were you? I've waited for you for 40 minutes up there. I'm like, they won't let me go see you. The world had changed. The world has changed on elections. It used to be, hey, you can put your equipment there. It's fine. Nobody's going to mess with it. We're Americans. We value that. We value that institution. And now we're at a part like, no, we really need to up our game and treat election equipment kind of like we treat the gate at the airport. It has to have some security protocols. It's not comfortable. It's not good, but it's where we're at. And that's a lot of that. The good news is most of that's not ongoing expense of funds. It's one-time money. Unless for some reason we realize we treat election security like IT security. You're secure today, but you may not be tomorrow. So you're constantly looking for the new thing that somebody may try to do to compromise your equipment.
There is some ongoing.
Yes.
You know, we've got a new facility we put together. It has key card access. It has alarms. It has cameras. It has lots of security features. Just to monitor and do the maintenance on that's about $1,200 a month.
Yeah.
And so when the legislature talks about every county should have cameras in the same thing, $1,200 a month is a lot, right?
It's especially when you deal with a county that has processes maybe only 5,000 voters in a presidential election year.
Right.
You're going to make for 5,000. If you're going to hack an election, that's not the county you're working on.
No, but what we also talk about is what's really important when one of those counties has a problem, it affects all of us.
Correct.
So when a smaller county does have a security issue, then it is blown up to all of us have a security issue. So it's no longer where only just a few counties have to meet those criteria. It needs to be everybody has to meet that criteria.
Yeah.
And that's an investment.
Yes.
And you know, you're right. It is interesting. I try to black out some elections, but I vaguely remember August of 22. There was a constitutional amendment.
I
don't know if
remember it
anybody
very
knows.
well.
In Kansas, we had
Very,
constitutional
very
amendment.
well.
Yeah. You know, the most fascinating, okay, I'm going to
Go to
digress for
town.
just a second. So I love statistics. I run my office on statistics. Rarely do you see an event that causes something to happen so quickly. And so we had, going into 22, up until the day the Supreme Court made their decision, I think we had about 120 advance applications, which is normal for an August even year election. Supreme Court made their decision, we were receiving hundreds an hour. I mean, that weekend we convened and said, okay, this is not the election we planned on. You know, we had that vote. And by the way, Douglas County was 82% no, right? A whole bunch of money was raised to do a recount. And they could only fund a few counties. And I swear, I was shocked we were chosen.
I'm not. I knew the individual who made the request.
But, so in Kansas, the only way you get your money back when you put money down for a recount is if it flips the result. There's no way you were going to flip the result in Douglas County. I mean, I was kind of flabbergasted. I mean, I only quit like once during that time. But the really cool thing about that investment they made in our county was it took us 3 days to hand recount. And 47,657 is the number of ballots that we reported at our official canvass. And 47,657 ballots is what we hand counted. We weren't long one, we weren't short one. And so their investment allowed me to now say to many people, look, the system worked. So, but they raised a lot of money to do that.
They did. From our perspective, and we tried to fix this law, you must ask for a recount before the Board of Canvassers meet. Well, hours before the Board of Canvassers meet, they're still counting provisional ballots. And I mean, I'm up by 2 votes, but I got 92 provisional ballots for the Board of Canvassers to meet. How do I know if I need a recount or not? So we did eventually fix the law the next year, but we were telling the counties, like, be prepared to recount, because the statute didn't say you must have the request and paid. It says you must have the request. And I said, but you got to start counting on Monday. So we had a hard stop that you will have the money. This individual said, well, I'm going to put my house up to secure the loan. I'm like, it's good. You know how long it's going to take to go through a title company? We are not accepting. I don't have time to do an appraisal on your house. And I don't want to own your house. So he put up his Cessna, what we believe is Cessna retirement, to get a credit card. And the credit card cleared for $180,000, and we recounted. With that one, our treasurer's race was close, so the person who lost that contest challenged a lot of counties. And then we had some legislators that lost that just challenged their own counties and paid for their own recounts, which was administratively challenging. But over 2/3 of the ballots in the state of Kansas were counted by hand. And I always tell the legislature, this is not like you played war as a kid. You mix the red deck of cards with the blue deck of cards, and now you got to separate them, red, blue, red, blue. No. You get 3 people on a panel, and your clerk holds up the ballot and said, do we all agree what this ballot says? Okay, there's 1. I mean, we're going through tens of thousands of ballots like that in 3 days. Not one county flipped. Our phones went from ringing about 10 to 15 times an hour about fraud to not getting a phone call in 4 straight hours. It was as much frustration as it was on the county level. It was the most redeeming thing for election officials. Guess what, crazy guy? They didn't screw it up. I know you're shocked. And I tell legislators now that say, well, what about the fraud here and there? I'm like, sir, you can contest your own victory.
Yeah. You know,
They never do.
One of the coolest parts of that story, it came out in the news that we got chosen. And I quit, and then I came back to work that morning.
When I showed up, I had a bunch of election board workers sitting in the parking lot, and they were like, let's go. We're ready to go. And I said, wait, hold on. We don't even have the go-ahead by the Secretary of State yet. They're like, okay, call us. We're ready.
We're here to go.
Ready to go. Okay, we're going to have time for questions. I have one last question and also statement. I think the really cool thing is that this is a combination of the Dole Center and the Kennedy Center.
Yep.
Because you already kind of broke the seal on this. The clerk is elected on a partisan level in Kansas. I'm a Democrat.
I am not.
And that does not impact our relationship.
Correct.
In elections, our parties shouldn't and don't matter when we work together, right? And both of us, I'm sure, can tell you there's people in our ear telling us I should go after Scott or Scott should come after me. One of the great things is Scott appointed me to the EAC Standards Board, and that was the first time that it happened for me, and that had nothing to do with politics. And so I very much appreciate not just this conversation, but our working relationship. So my final question is, you say that Kansas is perfect, but if you had a magic
I
wand,
didn't say perfect, I said best.
if you had a magic wand and could change something, what would it be? Unfunding or,
On funding, I wish if I could do one thing, and I often try, but I don't win, is to get the legislature to quit putting more duties on our county clerks. There's 4 counties in Kansas. If you hit a certain population threshold, they bifurcate the clerk's office into the county clerk that's often appointed. Some counties still elect that county clerk, but they clerk the county affairs. The other one becomes an election clerk appointed by me, reports to me, but is funded by the county. So, and there's an equilibrium there, because if I appoint someone they don't like, they don't fund the office, I look bad. Okay, so now I have to work with the county, and it forces it. Johnson County is a perfect example, because I'm forced to work with that county. And in Sedgwick, another situation.
and you live in that county.
And I live in that county, but Sedgwick's another situation where that election office has been grossly underfunded, because they got side the clerk and the county commissioner got sideways. And now we got an election clerk down there that really has a good relationship, and now they're increasing polling places, which is probably 10 years overdue. Go back to your question. I digress.
Your magic wand.
Yeah, it would be, so while all our other clerks are dealing with elections, and now we're doing post-election audits, which again, just show that, yeah, you do your job. Oh, now we want you to do an additional tax form that nobody understands and is due in the middle of an election.
Revenue neutiral rate.
And my wife's a pharmacist. She can do micro fractions in her head. She's like, I don't even understand what this says. It's things like that. It's like, do you want the election to go well? Okay, well then quit putting things on the clerk in these time frames. And so then adding a third election, which may be completely irrelevant after Super Tuesday, which is costing the state $5 million, is putting work on you all, because you're trying to get some notices and be prepared for things ahead of that schedule. And the legislature says, no, we just want the clerks to do it. And it's like, they can't do everything. You all are super people.
Well, yeah.
But you're not God. There are some things you can't do. And that's the one thing, is just to get the legislature to understand what clerks do.
Yeah, and mine, we've talked about it before. For the legislature to understand, even the smallest change has a cost to it.
Well, and
if you change, so I buy envelopes, you get a cost break. So I buy envelopes 25,000 at a time. And then the legislature makes like a 5-word change on that envelope.
Those are now irrelevant.
Well, I buy stickers and I hire people to come in and we put stickers over them.
On 5,000 envelopes.
And then they make a change and then you're like, well, okay, we can't re-sticker them. A good example right now is the watermark bill.
Yeah.
So
Midnight amendment.
Yeah, and I've been talking about this one quite a bit. So that ADA machine that we use uses ballot rolls. And so I spend, I don't know, $6 for a ballot roll, and it's not used that much, so I get a good 5-6 years out of it. Now with the watermark, which sounded really good, it's $25 a roll, and the watermark changes each year. So I have to get rid of those rolls and get new rolls.
Yeah.
Those, for them to understand that there's really a cost to even that slightest little change.
Yeah, and on the
yeah.
3-day grace period, they thought about, well, we'll just change the voter registration deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah, just change the deadline. That's, doesn't
Well,
affect
and that's the
anyone.
part you haven't talked about in the primary. It has all these different rules. Instead of voter registration closing 21 days prior, it's 30 days prior. Well, we had to change all of our instructions and everything. And
I'm
it's
traveling the
confusing.
state trying to explain it to the press.
yeah, so, all right.
Real
I
quick,
believe-
like, there is an important deadline if you're going to participate. Tuesday is the voter registration deadline. I'm assuming most everybody here is registered, but that's also the deadline to ask for an advance mail ballot.
Normally it's 7 days.
It's 0,
Yeah,
so.
right.
Right. Thank you both for this fascinating discussion. I know you all have some really wonderful questions out there. I want to remind everyone what Andrew laid the ground rules for our question and answer session, that they're going to be civil and they're going to be succinct and you're going to ask one. So I know, fire away. I know this group has a lot of questions. Abby and Allie will come to you if you raise your hand. They're going to hold the mic. And so how about we start here? And Jamie, I'll turn it over to you to pick from the audience.
I know you didn't mention mail-in balloting, and I will tell you, 4 years ago, I was very concerned when the postmaster started to remove the electrical sorting devices. So I want to know how has that impacted Kansas and the rest of the country?
I'm going to tell this story, okay? Because it's you, and it come from me. It's going to be better coming from you.
Oh.
The one thing Chris Kobach and Jamie Shew agreed on was a 3-day grace period, because mail processing centers were being closed. So if you're in liberal Kansas, your ballot goes to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to hopefully show up across the street at the clerk's office. The post office has Merriam, Kansas has not had mail delivered in the last 3 days. Maybe 4 days now. This is why it was so important we won the conversation on drop boxes. Because in this state, I can't put a drop box in front of my church or my school union. They're all run by the county. In our county, they have a chain of custody to handle the ballot. In most of our counties, you put it in the blue drop box at the post office, it may not show up across the street where there's the one with the red, white, and blue that says vote here. And you can drop it off at any polling place, advanced in-person polling place. You can drop it off at your county office. You can drop it off at any polling location on election day. This was what I told folks and saying, okay, you get rid of the drop box, you force increase U.S. mail. I owe you $10,000 in cash, let's say. You want me to mail it or drop it off at the house? That was why it was incumbent we won the argument on drop boxes while battling back the national conversation.
Yeah, I think part of it is voter education also, which is no longer can you drop something in the mail and it's going to make it, if you drop it here in Lawrence, it's not going to be there the next day because it now goes to the Kansas City processing station.
In Missouri.
Or if Northwest Kansas goes to
Denver.
North Platte or Denver, yeah.
Goes to Denver.
Yep. And so part of it is education. We talk to voters a lot to say, when you get that ballot, you need to mark it. And if you're going to mail it quick, right? Do not wait until Friday. One of the changes that was made, which was good, is we changed, you could ask for your ballot up until Friday before the election, right? We got it moved to a week ahead. And that's to try to change voter education. We're the only county in the state, we can track ballots kind of like an Amazon package through something called Ballot Scout. And one of the things is I'm able to see days of service. And in even year elections, the post office is really good at just kind of getting ballots through. And I can also see where ballots are, so I can call Kansas City and go, hey, my ballots are sitting on your loading dock. You got to move them. This passed in 23, the days of service from 66046, which is the zip code in our elections office, so from someone who dropped it off there to us, was 5 to 7 days. So it's really important that we just educate, because the post office, it's not going to go back to 2 to 3 days. So it's really important that we do have the alternative ways to drop off, but also educate voters. You've got to get it in the mail, and you've got to get it to us as soon as possible.
And also, we have votekansas.gov. And by the way, if it doesn't say .gov, it's not from us. And we have a ballot tracker, so you, like, I haven't got my ballot yet. Or you can check and see I sent my ballot in, and you can see if the clerk's office has actually received it yet. So we tell folks, if it's 3 days out of the election, just call the clerk's office. They will accommodate you. I mean, during the pandemic in Johnson County, we had poll workers driving to people that were hospitalized with COVID, making sure they were able to vote and get that ballot back to the clerk's office. So those are some tools that should help. And please share that with your friends.
Where do we stand on mailing out a vote-by-mail ballot to every registered voter?
Ballot or application?
Ballot.
It ain't ever gonna happen, I don't see.
No, I think I've said before, we'll be the 52nd state to do something like that.
Yeah. Again, 67 or 62% of the Kansas population votes in person. And so if I mail you a ballot, it creates voter confusion because one, they're going to throw it away, or they're going to discard it, leave it around. They don't know who's filling it because they never asked for that ballot. They're used to always voting in person. Most states that go to a mail-only election where they mail the ballot to the voter is because it's above that 65% threshold of those folks, that population is voting by mail anyway. Other states or jurisdictions that tried to move with a lower threshold really just had horrible voter turnout, massive administrative errors. And Kim Wyman, who used to be Secretary of State for the state of Washington, and a Republican Secretary of State, actually did the transition from in-person voting to mail-only voting. And she was very successful at it, but it was based on metrics. It was based on how do you know what that threshold is? And they funded her office well. It was like around 60 to 65%. You get there, then you can make that transition. And even still, she had a lot of frustrations because folks said, we've been voting in person for 40 years. It's a family event, and now it's gone.
And that's where it depends on the locale. We're at about 45 to 50%. Mm-hmm. So the transition for COVID wasn't as big of a deal for our community because we had so many people who had kind of transitioned. So if you're in Douglas County right now, I want to direct this comment to you. I asked about the application. That's a huge discussion in the legislature right now. So since 2012, I have sent out an informational brochure in September, and it includes an advance application and information on how to vote in person and so forth. And then in 2017, we started doing it in odd years. And so we've been doing it for a very long time. Well, it suddenly has become an issue at the legislature, and there is a bill that would ban the ability for me to do that. And that's huge because it has been a kind of a pressure valve for our operations. But when we started doing it in the odd year elections, it increased voter turnout by 7%. Because people knew about those city school elections. And that's where, okay, maybe legislators feel like it shouldn't happen in other counties, but allow me to do what works for my county and don't ban me the ability to do that.
And this is where I appreciate this conversation on federalism is because it's up to the county, right? I mean, maybe the counties want to do that, maybe they don't, but don't take the tool out of their tool belt. And this is, again, goes to the legislature, not the number of times I had legislators say, I got 9 ballots in the mail. No, you didn't. You got 9 applications in the mail. Well, that's what I meant.
Big difference.
Big difference.
Huge
big difference. And you telling all your neighbors you got 9 ballots in the mail, it's not helping the conversation.
Yeah, those of you that are in Douglas County, just be aware I already have plans in place that if it does pass, I've got to work around.
I don't see a veto override on that one.
No. So, other questions? We solved everything for you?
Plowed the field.
Wow.
Like good Kansans, we plowed the entire,
I
oh wait,
know.
you're from Missouri. He's a good Kansan.
Yeah.
And I'm going to apologize. Normally, I wouldn't come to the Dole Center and wear tennis shoes.
They're Jayhawk
They are,
shoes.
they are
They're great.
Jayhawks. My son got me
Yeah,
these
I really like them.
gave me these as a gift. My cousin, who's also my orthopedic surgeon, who also used to be my babysitter, did an ankle cleanup surgery on my ankle, and he says, you're not wearing dress shoes for 6 weeks. Part of me's happy, the other thing is like, well, what on earth am I going to wear? Well, if you come to the Dole Institute, you got to wear the KU shoes.
It looks way cooler than what I'm wearing.
I've
So,
got
yeah.
a lot of compliments.
Yeah.
So I was a little nervous coming in, feeling like I looked like Pee Wee Herman.
Thank you so much for this discussion tonight. It's been fascinating. I'm just curious what our percentages are right now for percent of citizens that are registered to vote, both Douglas County, Kansas, and nationally, how we compare, and then what percent of voters turn out to vote, where we're at right now.
As far as percentage of voter age population,
Percent
registered
of,
voters to voter age population,
so two separate questions.
Right.
So what percentage of our citizens are registered to vote? And then I'm curious if you got them off the top of your head, Douglas County, Kansas, national, and then of those registered voters, what are we seeing as typical turnout?
Thank
you.
So Douglas County is very interesting because we are very much a university town, not just here, but Haskell, Baldwin, which, by the way, we have a really cool initiative we're working on with Haskell. Commissioner Hovland and I went over there, met with some students and stuff today. But so our numbers always look a little different. We probably sit at about 83% of registered voters to voter age population. Our turnout, if you look at turnout, it always is a little less than many other counties because our rolls have a lot of inactive voters because of the students and so forth. In an even year like this upcoming one, we will probably be close to 70% turnout. The one I always talk about is for like our city school when we hope for 20%. And it depends on if there's an issue. The August 22 turnout was more than we actually had in November of 22. And the percentage I always talk about there is the 18 to 24-year-olds. Normally in an August 22, 18, 24-year-olds, I might get 5%. I had 52%. Then it dropped down to 30% in November. Did that answer your question? I threw a lot of numbers out there, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think, it's like, God, it's been so long since I've talked numbers because we don't do the local elections last November. The counties deal with it. We give some guidance, but really we're hands off because we don't certify that.
You're on a
as
beach or
state.
something, right?
Allegedly, or we're mountain skiing when I can, messing up my ankle worse. But we normally average around 67% depending on the year statewide. It's hard for us to know, number of citizens versus those registered because one, on the census, there's no citizen question mark or non-citizen, which I think is an important question because for us to know the number of legal resident non-citizens is really important for us as a state to manage our resources. However, I don't get how many Social Security numbers are there for residents in Kansas? Well, what Social Security considers resident doesn't match up with statute, what we call as a voting resident. So those numbers will never really get a clear picture on the percentage of that. But our voter turnout has been consistently going up. I'll say part of it's our clerks because the processes are getting consistent to vote. There's not much disruption. And I'll also say, we've been pretty good teaming with the clerks to prevent drastic law changes that would change the voter experience. Because if you change the voter experience, then suddenly folks are like, I don't even know how to vote anymore. And especially affects more of your senior population because they're like, I'm just not going to do this anymore. And so we've been really good about making sure that the voter interaction is a pleasant experience. There's not long lines. And it's not constantly changing. However, voter turnout, I've always advocated, said it is nothing I can really do. What motivates people to vote is compelling candidates and compelling issues. And that, I would say, the value of them both was a compelling issue, which is why it drove that out. If you have boring candidates, you know, sometimes your school board members, which you may want them to be boring. I totally understand. You don't want, you know, firebrand, crazy people that are throwing chairs in your school board meeting. But if you have one, you're going to increase voter turnout because people are going to want to probably have that person not on the school board anymore. So it's kind of a hard number to say. I already got asked in the press today, what's your expectation of voter turnout for the presidential preference primary? One, it's not Super Tuesday, so I don't know. And two, voter registration is still open. We don't know voter turnout till we have an idea of the new registrants we get. So folks are always anxious to know the future, but you know, it's like the great philosopher Yogi Berra once said, the problem with trying to predict the future is it keeps changing.
The number, the number that concerns me with Kansas, if you're interested in 18 to 24-year-old voting, there's Tufts University has some great research on 18 to 24-year-olds. And one of the things they look at is the gap of participation of 18 to 24-year-olds to all the other age groups. And we have one of the largest gaps in the country. What's interesting is when they do surveys of 18 to 24-year-olds in Kansas, we have one of the highest rates of participation in volunteerism. There's a disconnect between why our 18 to 24-year-olds are volunteering on policies and so forth that are being decided in the legislature and not participating. And somewhere, and I don't know where it is, we've got to make that connection.
We get them to volunteer to be a poll worker.
Yes, yes. You can, if you're 16 or above, you can be a board worker.
It's a great law.
Yeah, that is a huge one. And it also helps representation. I talk a lot. It's really important that our boards look like our community. And so that we continue to really do a lot of recruitment in all different communities so our boards reflect the voters that are walking in. Because 18 to 24-year-olds, it is, okay, so they're not gonna like that I talk about this. My oldest child grew up in elections. They were born 3 days after I filed for office. I do not recommend having a brand new baby and running for office. Although it makes really cute pictures. I had to vote for my daddy, right? So they grew up in my office, like doing all kinds of stuff in my office. They voted for the first time last year, and they said it was the most intimidating experience. Walking up to this older person, they were afraid they were going to make a mistake. They were just so nervous about making a mistake. And I'm like, okay, if Jake is nervous after growing up in this, what is that 18-year-old who has not been exposed to it? Like somehow we've got to reduce that.
Your kids are gentler than mine. Mine was 18, 22, and got the chip on his shoulder, walks in, gives his driver's license. He says, so Dad, is these the machines that you just change that dial on your watch and it changes the numbers? And I'm like, I am taking your truck away from you for a week.
Oh,
just do not joke around about
Jake
that.
worked as a 16-year-old as an election worker, and the next day had a whole list of how I did it wrong. So, right, you know, stuff was packed wrong. Yeah, yeah.
It's all your fault.
Right, yeah.
I think we have.
We can do one more. Charlie.
You know my name.
As a board worker.
Oh, thank you for being a board worker.
What do you think the results will be on Senate Bill 365, the voting rights bill?
I don't know. I know subject matters. I don't know bill numbers.
Is that U.S. Senate? You know, I think you mentioned H.R. 1 and so forth. I think all of those, I mean, the AAC commissioners, they're like, don't look at us. The problem with many of those is, I think, trying to do too much. You know, you mentioned that, like, the advanced voting, you know, even some of the advanced voting things in H.R. 1 were way more than I do.
Yeah,
it would have been way more than Greeley County used. I don't see it moving, any election stuff really moving.
I don't see anything in the Congress moving on election stuff, especially with the bifurcated Congress on party leadership, two war fronts that are affecting the United States between Ukraine and the United States, a surging Russia, and it being an election year. You know, we always say, do not pass massive legislation during a presidential election year, because that's just going to create so much confusion and frustration, and we can't administrate it quick enough.
Probably one of the biggest legislations I would love to see in Kansas and even at the federal level is protections of election workers.
Yes.
Of some type. That's one. And so I think if you, and I don't just say that because I have election workers here, I think the bills you can pass are the ones that are very narrow and specific versus doing these very large omnibus bills and throwing everything in there. I think if you could do some narrow ones, maybe.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, I'm used to death threats. You know, you get to this point, it's just workplace hazard. It's the election of poll workers that, you know, the story I had is a clerk who was in her 60s, her parents are in her 90s, got a phone call and said, we just want you to know we're parked outside your parents' house. That's a threat a clerk should never have to deal with. And she was fiery. She said, well, if you kill him, you save me time. Because she was fiery. She was a joke, but I mean, there's other people that, I mean, it's PTSD. They shouldn't have to have that threat.
I know we're getting it. In Kansas, 40% of the clerk, we've lost about 40% of the clerks since 2000.
Institutional knowledge.
And I know some more that probably will. And that's probably one of my larger concerns is we have a lot of brand new clerks getting ready to run a presidential election. And so we're providing them a lot of support, but we did lose quite a few. And that's across the country. That's just not the state of Kansas.
That's a national issue.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking these gentlemen for this wonderful conversation and their extraordinary leadership and public service. Thank you so much. We look forward to having a really fascinating conversation tomorrow as it unfolds with our elections experts and elections administrators tomorrow. For those of you who are interested in coming back to our public programming on Tuesday, February 20th, we're going to have the first installment of our discussion group series for this spring, Obstacles and Opportunities, Tackling Sustainability in Kansas. And that's going to be conversations led by our Dole Fellow, who is a county commissioner, Karen Wiley. You won't want to miss the conversation that starts next Tuesday, again, February 20th at 4 o'clock here at the Institute. It's going to be on the Farm Bill. So we look forward to seeing you back here. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.